on your Viddy's
Oh,
win.
thank you. Thank you very much.
Very prestigious award, and welcome to the show today. I'm really excited to have you on.
Thank you.
So let's jump in to get us all started. Tell everybody listening about your career so far and your role in Insights.
Yeah, so I work at Liberty Mutual. I do research, particularly on our brand and our advertising. So a lot of work with TV commercials and understanding how consumers perceive Liberty and its competitors. Been here about 2.5 years. Before that, I was in management consulting and based in Boston for my entire career so far.
Awesome. We were just having this conversation the other day about internally about how Insights really sits in so many different divisions within
Yeah.
companies, and like hearing about you, like your focus being on brand and advertising versus product innovation, or what's the kind of lay of the land over at Liberty Mutual?
Yeah, so it's funny. A lot of times when people ask what I do, I have a hard time saying whether or not I do marketing or research. I always like to think about it as I do research, and the application is marketing and brand. But there are so many. You're totally right. There are so many different applications of it. We at Liberty, we have a sort of centralized research team that has researchers that do UX and brand and research on our agents and customer-specific research. So all sorts of different applications. We all sit now on one team. Previously, we had sort of sat within different departments with our stakeholders until we had a reorg about a year or two ago, and so now we all sit together, which is nice that we get to cross-pollinate a little more.
Yeah, I love hearing that, actually, because I have heard, there's a lot of challenges probably no matter what, but certainly when you're, kind of siloed off in different groups, it's probably nice to have a centralized team.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes all of us better to get to learn about research that isn't exactly what we're doing, but is similar and relevant. We've now had a lot of projects get done with people that are on sort of different parts of the research team, and that sort of allows us to have sort of a single viewpoint for a lot of issues that maybe different teams would have worked on separately in the past.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so you mentioned you do brand perception work, competitive research, but today we're going to talk about ad testing. So can you walk us through a little bit high level your process when you're doing ad testing?
Yes. So not going to give away the secret sauce, but so we have we do lots of testing for our ads. That's one of the things that is exciting about working at Liberty. Not to malign any of our competitors, but I believe we're the best in the industry at making sure that data informs informs our advertising. So we have both a quant and qual aspects to our pre-market testing, which is done by two of my colleagues, Jenn Vogel and Haley Gelberg, and that so. There's a survey aspect. And then generally when we want to dive into more specific things, understand things that are less quantitative, sort of could be something as simple as what people find funny, what people find weird. Then a lot of times we'll dive in to qual for that. And then I mostly handle our sort of once the creative actually goes on TV. So I do a lot of research on understanding how an ad is performing, how our advertising as a whole is performing compared to competitors. And there are both quant and qual aspects to that as well. A lot of times when we want to understand a theme a little bit better, we'll turn to qual. I always like to say that quant is very good for the what, and qual is really good for the why and how.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm scribbling my notes. Most of the time people can't see me doing that, but now I'm back on screen. You see me scribbling furiously. What's that?
Stops too quickly.
I know, right? Yeah, keep talking. I love hearing that you've got like such a breadth of like quant and qual at all stages? Like, is it typically, like you mentioned, quant, then qual? Is there ever a case where you do qual first, or like, how do you make those decisions?
It depends. I mean, honestly, generally we use qual to answer or try to answer like a specific question.
Hmm.
So it sort of depends on where in the process the question arises. So it could be that we test an ad and there's a theme that comes up that we don't or fully understand. So maybe something comes off a little creepy or confusing or and from perhaps to us a spot will make sense or not come off in that way, but that's generally when we get something that sort of surprises us, and that tends to lead to qual, and that can be both before and after quant testing. So it could be that, for example, we have a concept that we're looking at, and a concept that we're looking at, and want to get into sort of, oh, if we have a question from a stakeholder or something, that then we'll go and maybe do qual for that. If we see something in our quant testing as well that gets mentioned, we might do it then. Sometimes it's even, sometimes we do stuff after the fact. We had an ad a few years ago. It actually has now been brought back onto TV with our struggling actor, Liberty Bibberty guy.
Mm.
And we've done qual research to understand just why people liked it so much. So it really can be at any point. It's sort of to answer a question that isn't really numerical.
Yeah. I loved hearing about that example a couple of years ago of like, we knew this ad was going to be good because of our pre-testing. We didn't know it was going to be that good. And
Yeah,
really like trying to figure out why, like, how can you replicate that, right? Like you
yeah,
clearly hit on
that
something.
was exactly what we were. Yeah, that was exactly what the qual research was for.
Yeah. And so tell me, how do you kind of frame those qual questions? How do you, because obviously,
Yeah.
quant is quite different from qual, and you don't want to ask a yes or no question, especially
Yes.
when your consumer's time is so valuable. So
Yeah.
how do you approach that?
It's funny. So we actually, a colleague of mine, Nala Clay, is actually working on a Vox Populi project right now, and we were workshopping the questions, and it's really important to be careful with how you word these questions, particularly in an instance where you're not going to get sort of a follow up. Um, so I found that you are best off when you, for lack of a better term, hit the consumer over the head with what you want them to say. And that's not to say leading them, but
Mhm.
um, I try to be very, very precise in the way I word questions so that they know exactly what it is that I am trying to get them to talk about. Because if you have something that is even remotely vague, there will be at least some of your respondents will go and start talking about something else. So picking your words very carefully and telling them exactly what it is you want to talk about is crucially important. And then I also find that not having you can't have your question be too long. So if, for example, you have a prompt that has like 4 sentences in it, there is no
Mhm.
way that they're going to read that, and so you'll end up missing something. So the key, it's sort of a delicate balance to try and get it both, making sure that it's very, very clear what you want, but also making sure that like they're actually going to read it and like look closely at
Mhm.
it.
Yeah. And I would imagine some of that too, and how you frame those questions depends on what we were talking about before. Like, when in the
Yep,
process are you asking that question?
absolutely.
Because, like you said, if you've gotten some information from Quant and you really need a specific answer as to why,
Yep.
whatever, you do need to be that precise. Whereas I also see on the flip side, sometimes being vague actually, like
Yeah.
people going off and talking about something else is exactly what you
Yeah.
want.
No, it's interesting. I mean, you have to, on the one hand, and there are a lot of instances where you really want that specific answer that we
Mhm.
hammering home on one thing. But at the end of the day, if there's going to be, if some consumer has a reaction to something that we're showing them, we want to make sure we know about it because there will absolutely be someone else that also has that reaction, likely lots and lots of people. So
Right.
it's it's interesting. I mean, you can really use it for a lot of different applications. I found that generally we are a little bit more sort of wide open, getting that sort of vague, what do you think type responses earlier on, which makes sense when you're kind of
Yep.
getting ready to or creating something. And then a lot of times later on, it's a little bit more targeted.
Yeah.
That said, I mean, there at times we'll have different versions of ads. So, and we'll maybe there's a different line or a different joke or whatever it is, and we'll show both and get people's thoughts. So it not always, it varies. And
Sure, sure.
I mean, in one particular, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. You
Oh,
keep going. This is your show.
No, that's not good. No, I mean, early on in COVID actually was a particularly, at times it can be a little bit more targeted even before the creative process. I mean, when COVID launched, when COVID started, it was really difficult to know what was acceptable in an ad or not. That all of a sudden, like, oh, are we allowed to be funny? Are we allowed to show people in crowds? Like, do we have to, like, what is okay? Will people be mad at us for doing something? Will we be seen as insensitive or something along those lines? And so that was an instance where we were asking sort of very specific questions and researching very specific things, or even before we were like making things. So it varies just based on what it is that you want to know and where we are in the process.
Yeah, for sure. And that's so like something I don't even think about because we don't run big TV spots, right? So interesting to me. But I mean, there were so many brands that were kind of getting it from people in early COVID for being insensitive or for showing people in crowds. And clearly, like spots that had been booked for ages,
Yeah,
or, nobody was even able to get together to film new commercials. So,
yeah,
it was that's so interesting to kind of get that more
yeah.
general sense.
And that's actually brings up sort of an interesting part of this job, is that a lot of times the answers to questions that you will get, the answers don't stay the same. So for
Mhm.
example, maybe we will do, and COVID is probably a particularly good example of this, but we'll film something or come up with something or do something that is totally fine at the time that we made it. But something in the world can change. Something is different that will cause something to be received differently. I mean, I think a particularly good example right now is sort of what's going on with Russia, that
Mhm.
maybe 6 months ago, there wouldn't be any problem with there being some sort of Russian something in a commercial. Whereas now, like, that's generally not, that's something that brands would go way out of their way to avoid. So that's something that is always sort of interesting in considering when you want to play certain ads, what ads you want to make. It's sort of, I always sort of play your best ads. Think that we should play our best ads first, because you never know if something might change. So,
Mhm.
but COVID was a particularly good example of that, sort of changing what was acceptable.
Yeah, almost overnight seemingly. And, like, how quickly can you pull an ad? Like, it seems like
Our
sometimes
our
it takes some time.
our brand strategy and advertising team is very fast. They are
Yeah.
wonderful at what they do. There have been times that I've been, particularly early on in COVID, that it was like a day, like I would turn off my laptop at the end of the day, and the next morning I'd wake up and see, like, oh, we made this move and it's done now, and they're very good.
Yeah.
um,
That's important, almost just as important as getting them live is probably taking
yes.
them down.
Oh yes. Yeah. No. They are wonderful at what they do.
Amazing. And so, you definitely throughout the life cycle, it seems you've got a lot of different sources for data and different types of data that you're pulling in. How do you merge that all together to combine the results and analyze in one place?
Yeah. So a lot of times, and I sort of similar to what I said before, a lot of times what we find in quant will sort of inform what we look for in qual and what parts of the qual we're actually interested in.
Mhm.
So a lot of times the quant is a really great place to start. So for example, we might say like, oh, X% of respondents thought that this ad was funny, or whatever it is that we're looking at. And then a lot of times after it's more of the explanation of like, okay, why? It's interesting. I mean, there have been times that our ads can be a little weird. Like we had one in particular with wet teddy bears that was a little bit of an odd concept, very memorable ad though. It stuck in people's head, but for some people that aren't really into that kind of absurdist humor, particularly sort of internally, like trying to understand like, okay, well, I don't really get this. Like, I don't find this funny without the qual. It's kind of like, it makes it hard to believe the quant to a certain extent. So if, for example, I just don't find that, say someone doesn't find like that sort of silly, weird, absurdist, wet teddy bear humor, I guess you should go watch the ad if you haven't seen it. Humor funny, and then someone shows me a statistic that says like, really, like 73% of, random number, 73% of people thought this ad was funny. I feel like I would have had trouble believing it. And maybe that's even on a subconscious level that quant doesn't quite hit home as hard if you don't fully understand why. But if you show that 73% and then you have quotes or videos or whatever it is of people saying like, oh, well, I find this funny because of X, Y, and Z, or it reminds me of something that I like, or that this, maybe not even explaining the joke necessarily, but at least sort of understanding why other people like it.
You've hit on so many key points there. Like, I mean, the believability piece, like, I think that it is very common to
Yeah.
like look at data, forget that there's real people on the other side of
Yeah.
it, and find it maybe hard to believe, right? So when you
Yeah.
actually hear it out of a real live person's mouth, it's so much more powerful.
It's funny. I mean, so much of a lot of people sort of think about the actual sort of research process when they think about researchers, that thinking about the data analysis, writing the surveys, questions, but such a big part of it is explaining what you found. It's not just what you can find and what you learn, but if it's not accessible and clear and easy to follow and easy to understand, it's not really going to make much of a difference to people that are actually making those decisions.
Yeah.
So, and that's all to say, we are very, very fortunate that our brand strategy and advertising team is so hungry for this sort of data, and so luckily we have it a lot easier. The research at Liberty have a lot easier in that sort of understanding is the wrong word, but sort of getting our findings implemented. That there's just such a hunger and desire to make things as good as they can be here, which is really very, very, very lucky that we get to work with them.
For sure. Do you think that's gotten even become even more prevalent given
Yeah.
the pandemic and, like you said, people are changing so quickly?
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, things have moved a lot faster. I've found that, I think for a couple of reasons. Is one that so much of, or particularly early on in the pandemic, so much, and you sort of said it yourself, things changed overnight. So much of like what was socially acceptable changed really fast. And there have been plenty of things since that have changed that quickly, whether it's sort of perceptions of police or what's going on with Russia, that there are also that, and this might be a function of my age, but things are moving faster than they had in the past. And then in order to try and deal with that, we found research had to get quicker. We had to be able to make changes, learn things faster. And I now that because we sort of had to develop those capabilities, that now it's something we can do. So that now that we can learn things faster and make decisions quicker, that it's something that's sort of become more normal.
Totally. We've been hearing that from like all over the industry, right? Like, there is more of a hunger to understand people from other areas of the business and demand for that to be faster. But, it's happening. Like the world is changing faster and we're able to research faster. And, one of the other things you touched on before that I wanted to bring back up is, this has got to be like a daily, I don't want to use the word struggle because I don't think it's a struggle for people, but a daily consciousness to like put aside your own biases. Like I don't find that ad funny. So I'm
Yeah,
seeing all this data. Like how do you do that like all day long?
it's what's funny. It's funny. That's definitely something that you have to deal with. That I always sort of like to say that it doesn't matter what I think or what you think or what one person thinks, but it matters what everyone thinks.
Hmm.
So it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I love so much about working at Liberty, compared to sort of experience I've had elsewhere or have heard from other people in the industry, that their decisions are made much more based on what others think or what sort of the market as a whole thinks, as opposed to sort of one person in charge giving their opinion. And part of that is just like we have new research capabilities in the past 10, 15 years that weren't available before.
Hmm.
I think a lot about sort of Mad Men style creative and managing advertising that's just sort of people in a room sitting and thinking like, yeah, this is a good idea, or
Right.
this makes sense to me. And part of and I'm very fortunate that Liberty is nothing at all like that.
Hmm.
But I imagine that would be difficult to work in, and you're going to prevent yourself from getting running things as well as possible. It's I think naturally people that do research are biased, as people in any other industry are biased in some sort of way. That no one perfectly matches the market as a whole. So it's very important to not let your own personal thoughts and opinions influence decisions. Luckily for me, I love everything that we do, so it's very easy.
That is a benefit. Oh, welcome. There's Henrik joining the show. We almost made it, but
Oh, well, very
no
cute.
such luck. Um, so, going back to what we were talking about with, then sharing the results, like that's not just enough to discover some great new insight and learn new things, but actually communicating that with the people that need to hear about it, need to make decisions with
Mhm.
that information. How are you communicating those results, and then how are the teams you're collaborating with using them?
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, a lot of times the communication will come not so much from us like sitting, and we do presentations and things like that, but a lot of times it's like there's such a desire on the part of our stakeholders to learn things that they'll like just ask us questions, and it's much more of a pull from their part and then a push from ours. But yeah. We're lucky that our stakeholders are very interested in what we have to say. A lot of times in our at the end of our research, we'll make recommendations based on what we found and what we think based on what we think would lead to the best outcome. Uh, we always discuss that with the brand strategy and advertising team, that it's definitely a team effort, that there are, as much as sort of we do research and are sort of the most familiar with the research because that's what we do, they are a lot more familiar with a lot of the more sort of intricate advertising related stuff. So we're very lucky that we have such a collaborative relationship with our stakeholders, and so that's it's not really ever there's never any sort of or there's never a lack of desire for research and insights to help them make their decisions. So I certainly a bit spoiled. I know that's not the case. I know that's not the case everywhere. So very fortunate to get to work with the people that I do, both on the
Yeah.
research side and on the brand strategy advertising side.
For sure. I was just thinking that, like, oh, I love hearing that. I love hearing that,
Yeah.
like, the insights function is so valued at
Yeah.
Liberty Mutual.
Yeah, and that's I've from what I've heard is true across the board with stakeholders at Liberty outside of marketing and advertising too. That it's a ton of fun getting to be at a company that cares about
Yeah.
this stuff. Liberty has exceeded my expectations in just sort of how 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 much desire there is to use data to inform decisions. It's fun. It's fun getting to do that because it allows us to compete with, particularly in marketing and advertising, with competitors that have much larger spends: Progressive,
Mm.
Geico, Allstate, State Farm. And I always sort of think about it like Moneyball in the Oakland A's, that we are not quite as big, but we're still competing with the biggest in the industry, and have best in class ads in a lot of instances, and get to see and have been seeing really strong growth for our brand over the last 5-10 years, and despite having less money. And that I would argue that likely comes from a adherence to, or using data and research to make decisions, as opposed to sort of not saying that our competitors are doing this, but as opposed to the sort of Mad Men style, sitting in a room, this is
Mm.
what I think type stuff.
That's such a powerful correlation. Like, invest in data and insights and get more return in your advertising dollars or your marketing
That's the
spend, right?
goal. That's the goal.
Right? That's awesome. Now, to the extent that you can share, what's been like one thing that you've learned that's been really surprising to you about, any of the work that you've done, any of the ads that
Wow.
you've run, has there been anything that's just really shocked you?
That's a good question. I think the thing that I didn't really realize when I started is just how how interpretations of things can vary so wildly. That I mean, you can that I guess maybe when you're not in research and you're just sort of experiencing these sorts of things as a consumer, that you don't quite realize just how many different reactions to one thing there can be. Um,
Mm,
that it's like there are people that will find something funny or not funny or offensive or heartwarming, or all sorts of different. There could be tons and tons of completely different reactions to the same stimuli. So that, I think, is something that I guess I knew to a certain extent would be the case. I mean, if everyone reacted the same, there wouldn't be any point of doing
mm,
doing research. But
mhm.
I remember being a little bit surprised, like, wow, it really does vary a ton. And that always surprised me. But I think makes the work a lot more interesting, and is part of what makes it so valuable.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been really fun. I can't thank you enough for coming on the
Yeah.
show
Oh, of
today and
course.
sharing with us about the work you're doing at Liberty Mutual. And I think everybody's seen the ads, right? And so to kind of see some of the the
Yep.
power that's happening behind the scenes is really fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming on. Thank you, everyone, for listening in and joining us today. Join me next week for another episode where I speak to the famed futurist, Faith Popcorn. We'll see you then.